Welcome, dear listeners, to the shadows of another night. I am Elias Nocturne, keeper of the unholy chronicles and guardian of tales that dare not speak their names in daylight. Tonight, as the candles cast their uncertain light across these ancient pages, I bring you a story of power, deception, and immortal ambition from the glittering court of Versailles. Ah, yes, here it is. Written in ink that seems to shimmer like dried blood, I find the account of Jean-Baptiste de Morangias, a vampire who walked among kings and shaped the destiny of nations. In the court of Louis XIV, the legendary Sun King, this creature of shadow played a game so dangerous, so intricate, that its echoes still resonate through the corridors of power. How fitting that in the Palace of Mirrors, the most influential figure cast no reflection at all. But before I unveil this tale, I must warn you, what you're about to hear will forever change how you view the grand palace of Versailles. For in its gilded halls and secret passages, immortal creatures waged a silent war for control of France itself, while the so-called Sun King remained blissfully unaware of the true power behind his throne. Gather close, my friends, as I read from these forbidden pages. Let the candlelight guide us through a story of darkness that dwelled in the heart of the most splendid court Europe has ever known. Versailles, 1670. The candlelight in the Hall of Mirrors cast 1,000 reflections, yet Comte Jean-Baptiste de Morangias cast none. He had perfected the art of positioning himself so that none would notice this telling absence, a skill honed over 3 centuries of existence. Tonight, as King Louis XIV held court, the Comte stood in his customary place among the shadows between the towering windows, observing the glittering assemblage with eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties. "My dear Comte," came the unmistakable voice of the Sun King himself, "you seem lost in contemplation. Share your thoughts with us." Jean-Baptiste stepped forward with practiced grace, his crimson coat catching the light like fresh blood. He had chosen his current appearance carefully when infiltrating the French court decades ago, handsome enough to command attention but not so striking as to overshadow the king's own beauty. His dark hair was immaculately styled in the latest fashion, and his pale skin, once a marker of his undead nature, now merely marked him as a proper nobleman who never laboured under the sun. "Your Majesty honours me with his attention," Jean-Baptiste replied, his voice carrying the subtle accent of old Provence. "I was merely admiring how the splendour of Versailles grows with each passing season, much like your Majesty's glory." Louis smiled, pleased as always by flattery, especially when delivered with such seemingly genuine admiration. The king had no way of knowing that Jean-Baptiste had helped design several elements of the palace specifically to aid his kind. The labyrinthine corridors that allowed for quick escape, the numerous hidden passages, and the carefully positioned mirrors that could be used to detect others of his kind. "You are too kind, my friend," Louis responded, gesturing for Jean-Baptiste to join his inner circle. "Though I must say, your counsel regarding the placement of the mirrors was particularly inspired. The effect is magnificent." Jean-Baptiste bowed deeply, suppressing a smile. The mirrors had been his masterstroke, convincing the Sun King to surround himself with the very tools that could expose a vampire, while simultaneously creating so many reflections that any single missing one would go unnoticed in the chaos of light and crystal. As he took his place among the king's favourites, Jean-Baptiste caught the eye of Marquise de Montespan, the king's current mistress. She alone among the court knew his true nature, though not by his choice. He had been careless one night, his hunger getting the better of him in the gardens, and she had witnessed him feeding on a young garde du corps. Instead of fleeing in terror, she had approached him with an offer, her silence in exchange for his support in maintaining her position as the king's favourite. It was an arrangement that suited them both. The Marquise kept her power, and Jean-Baptiste gained a useful ally who could move about in daylight. More importantly, she helped maintain his cover by ensuring he was invited to dine with her privately when court etiquette demanded his presence at meals. "Comte," the king continued, "what are your thoughts on the Dutch situation? Our intelligence suggests they grow more obstinate by the day." Jean-Baptiste considered his response carefully. The Dutch Republic represented a particular problem for his kind. Their Protestant ways and merchant culture made them less susceptible to the sort of manipulation that worked so well in Catholic courts. Moreover, their naval supremacy threatened the carefully established vampire havens in the French colonies. "Your Majesty, the Dutch grow wealthy on the seas that rightfully belong to France. Their success breeds arrogance, and their Protestant hearts harbour no proper respect for the divine right of kings." He paused, letting his words sink in. Perhaps it is time to remind them of France's power. Louis's eyes gleamed with interest. War with the Dutch had been brewing for years, and Jean-Baptiste had been quietly encouraging it. Conflict would provide excellent cover for vampire activities, and the chaos of battle would make disappearances less noteworthy. "You speak boldly, Comte," remarked Minister Colbert, his suspicious nature ever present. Of all the king's advisers, Colbert worried Jean-Baptiste the most. The man's methodical mind and attention to detail made him dangerous, though he had yet to notice anything amiss about the Comte. "I speak as one devoted to His Majesty's glory," Jean-Baptiste replied smoothly. "The Dutch grow rich while mocking our faith and your Majesty's authority. They build their fortunes on trade that should rightfully flow through French ports." The king nodded thoughtfully, while Colbert's frown deepened. Jean-Baptiste knew he would have to be careful. The minister's influence was considerable, and his scrutiny could become problematic. As the evening wore on, Jean-Baptiste circulated through the court with practiced ease. He paid particular attention to the newly arrived nobles from the provinces, identifying potential allies and threats among them. His kind had agents throughout France, and it was his responsibility to ensure Versailles remained safe for their activities. Near midnight, he received an urgent message delivered by one of his trusted servants. Another vampire had arrived at court without proper introduction, a serious breach of both mortal and immortal etiquette. Worse still, this newcomer had already fed on one of the palace guards. "Your Majesty," Jean-Baptiste addressed the king, "I regret that I must attend to an urgent matter at my estate. With your permission, I shall take my leave." Louis waved his permission, already distracted by the Marquise de Montespan's latest wit. Jean-Baptiste bowed and departed, his mind racing with plans. The newcomer would have to be dealt with quickly and quietly. He found the intruder in the gardens, a young vampire still drunk on blood and power. The fool hadn't even bothered to hide the guard's body properly, leaving it barely concealed behind a hedge. "You forget yourself," Jean-Baptiste spoke softly, centuries of authority filling his voice. "This is not some provincial town where such carelessness can be overlooked." The young vampire spun around, blood still staining his lace cravat. "Who are you to dictate to me? The knights belong to our kind." "The knights belong to those wise enough to protect them," Jean-Baptiste replied, moving faster than mortal eyes could follow. His hand closed around the young vampire's throat. "I am the appointed guardian of Versailles, endorsed by the Council of Night. Your actions threaten everything we have built here." Fear finally showed in the young one's eyes. I didn't know. I thought—" "You didn't think at all." Jean-Baptiste's grip tightened. "Now you have a choice. Submit to my authority and learn our ways, or face final death. Choose quickly." The young vampire's struggle lasted only moments before he went limp in surrender. "I submit," he whispered. Jean-Baptiste released him. Good. You will help me dispose of your victim properly, and then we shall discuss your education in our ways. Versailles operates under strict rules, rules that have kept our kind safe here for decades. As they dealt with the body, Jean-Baptiste explained the intricate dance that allowed vampires to thrive in the heart of the Sun King's court. The careful selection of victims, the proper disposal of bodies, the networks of loyal human servants, and most importantly, the absolute necessity of maintaining their masquerade. The King's court provides us with everything we need, he explained, but only if we are subtle. Louis builds his palace of mirrors and light, never realizing that shadows grow stronger in bright places. We feed on the ambitious and the desperate, those who would trade anything, even their blood, for a chance at power. The young vampire, who had introduced himself as Philippe, listened intently. But surely the king suspects something. All these disappearances. Jean-Baptiste smiled coldly. The Sun King sees what he wishes to see. When courtiers vanish, he assumes they have fallen from favor and fled in shame. When bodies are found, they are attributed to mundane violence or political intrigue. Humans have a remarkable capacity for self-deception. They returned to the palace through one of the secret passages Jean-Baptiste had helped design. As they walked, he continued his instruction. Tomorrow night, you will be properly introduced at court as my distant cousin. I will teach you how to move among the nobles, how to feed without detection, and most importantly, how to serve our greater purpose. And what is that purpose? Philippe asked. To guide human society in a direction that benefits our kind. Wars, policies, alliances, all can be shaped to create better hunting grounds and safer havens for vampires. Louis dreams of making France the greatest power in Europe, never realizing that his ambitions serve our needs perfectly. The following week saw Philippe integrated into court life under Jean-Baptiste's careful guidance. The young vampire learned quickly, though his modern sensibilities sometimes clashed with the older vampire's more traditional approaches. I don't understand, Philippe complained one evening. Why do we waste time manipulating these mortals? We could simply take what we want by force. Jean-Baptiste sighed, having heard similar arguments countless times over the centuries. Force invites resistance. Terror breeds heroes. But give humans a beautiful lie to believe in, and they will defend it with their lives. Look at Versailles. Every noble here knows the court runs on flattery and deception, yet they embrace the illusion because it glorifies them as well. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the Marquise de Montespan. She entered Jean-Baptiste's private chambers without ceremony, her face flushed with anger. The king grows tired of me, she announced. That little Fontange girl has caught his eye. Jean-Baptiste dismissed Philippe with a gesture before turning to the Marquise. My dear Athénaïs, surely you're not surprised. Louis's appetites have always been varied. Do not patronize me, vampire, she snapped. I have kept your secrets and supported your schemes. Now I require your help in return. He studied her carefully. The Marquise had indeed been a valuable ally, but she was becoming increasingly unstable as her influence over the king waned. What exactly are you suggesting? Deal with her. Make her disappear, like so many others have disappeared at court. Her eyes gleamed with desperate malice. Surely one more missing courtier won't raise any suspicions. You forget yourself, madame, Jean-Baptiste replied coldly. I am not your personal assassin. The girl has done nothing to threaten our security. The Marquise laughed bitterly. No? What if I were to tell the king what you are? What if I revealed all I know about the monsters lurking in his perfect palace? Jean-Baptiste moved too quickly for human eyes to follow, pinning her against the wall with one hand. Then, my dear, You would learn why it is unwise to threaten one such as me. Your death would be attributed to apoplexy, or perhaps a dose of poison from one of your many rivals. The king would mourn briefly, then turn all his attention to Mademoiselle de Fontanges. Fear replaced anger in the Marquise's eyes. You would kill me? After all I've done for you? I would rather not, he admitted, releasing her. You have indeed been useful, but never mistake pragmatic cooperation for weakness, Athenais. I have survived centuries by eliminating threats before they materialize. She smoothed her dress with trembling hands. What am I to do then? Simply accept my fall from grace? You are clever enough to maintain your position without resorting to murder, he replied. The king's appetites may wander, but his habits are constant. Give him what Fontanges cannot, wit, experience, the comfort of familiar pleasures. The Marquise's expression turned thoughtful. Perhaps, yes, I see what you mean. The girl is beautiful, but naive. She'll bore him quickly enough. Exactly. Now, shall we speak of more important matters? There are rumours of a Jansenist plot that could be useful to us. As winter descended on Versailles, Jean-Baptiste's carefully maintained order faced its greatest challenge. A series of deaths among the nobility, deaths that were clearly the work of vampires, threatened to expose everything he had built. The victims were found drained of blood, their bodies positioned in ways that seemed designed to attract attention. Worse still, they were left in places where they would be quickly discovered, making it impossible to disguise the true nature of their deaths. Another one, Philippe reported, entering Jean-Baptiste's chambers just before dawn. The Duchess de Montpensier's lady-in-waiting, left in the Hall of Mirrors itself. Jean-Baptiste cursed softly. This is no random violence. Someone is trying to expose us. He paced the room, his mind racing through possibilities. Who else knows about this latest victim? The body was found by a servant, but I intervened before anyone else could see it. It's being disposed of now. Good. We need to end this quickly. The king has already ordered Colbert to investigate the disappearances. Jean-Baptiste had spent decades carefully cultivating his position at court, and he wouldn't let some rogue vampire destroy everything. His investigation led him to an unexpected source, the Vampire Council itself. A faction within the council had decided that the French court had grown too powerful, that Jean-Baptiste's influence over Louis XIV posed a threat to the balance of power among vampire communities. The council had sent one of their own, a vampire named Isabella, who had once been a Spanish noblewoman during the Reconquista. She was as clever as she was brutal, and she had already gathered supporters among the younger vampires at court. Your time is over, Jean-Baptiste, Isabella told him when they finally confronted each other in the palace gardens. The council grows tired of your subtle games. The old ways are changing. The old ways keep us safe, he replied. Your actions risk exposing all of us. Perhaps exposure is exactly what we need, she smiled. Let the humans know what hunts them. Let them learn to fear the night again. Fear leads to hatred, and hatred to destruction. Have you forgotten the witch hunts? The Inquisition? Jean-Baptiste's voice carried the weight of centuries of witnessed persecution. I will not let you undo everything we have built here. The battle that followed was invisible to mortal eyes, fought with preternatural speed and strength in the shadows of Versailles. In the end, Jean-Baptiste's experience proved greater than Isabella's ambition. He stood over her ashes as the first light of dawn threatened the horizon. Philippe emerged from where he had been watching. The council won't be pleased. The council will understand, Jean-Baptiste replied, brushing ash from his coat. They sent her to test me as much as to challenge me. Now they know that Versailles remains under firm control. The political fallout required all of Jean-Baptiste's skill to manage. He arranged for several of Isabella's conspirators to be found dead, apparently killed in a dispute over gambling debts. Others simply vanished, their disappearances blamed on the general intrigue of court life. Colbert's investigation was carefully misdirected toward a supposed plot by Dutch agents, feeding into the king's existing prejudices and helping to build support for the coming war. The Marquise de Montespan, proving her continued worth, helped spread rumours that supported this narrative. In the end, the crisis passed, and life at Versailles returned to its normal rhythms of artifice and deception. Jean-Baptiste resumed his role as the king's trusted advisor, continuing to shape events to benefit his kind while maintaining their careful anonymity. One evening, as he stood in his customary place watching the court's elaborate dance, Louis XIV approached him again. "You seem troubled, my friend," the king observed. "These recent events have cast a shadow over our court." Jean-Baptiste bowed slightly. "All shadows pass, Your Majesty. Versailles shines too brightly for darkness to linger long." Louis smiled, pleased by the metaphor. "Indeed. Though I must admit, there are times when I wonder about the true nature of power in my court. So many secrets, so many hidden currents." For a moment, Jean-Baptiste felt a flicker of concern, wondering if the king suspected more than he revealed. But Louis's next words reassured him. "It is good to have advisers I can trust," the king continued. "Men like you, who understand the importance of maintaining proper order." "Your Majesty is too kind," Jean-Baptiste replied, even as he smiled inwardly at the irony. "I live only to serve." And so the dance continued, the vampire and the Sun King, each using the other for their own ends. Versailles glittered with 1,000 mirrors, while in the spaces between reflections, the true powers of the court went about their ancient business. Jean-Baptiste knew that other challenges would come. There would be more ambitious young vampires, more suspicious ministers, more dangerous allies like the Marquise. But he had survived centuries by understanding that the greatest power lay not in brute force or obvious domination, but in the careful manipulation of human desires and fears. As the century drew to a close, Jean-Baptiste found himself facing a new threat, one that emerged not from the vampire councils or suspicious courtiers, but from the very institution he had worked so long to infiltrate. The Sun King's increasing devotion to religious matters, influenced by Madame de Maintenon's pious guidance, had begun to cast an uncomfortable light into Versailles' darkest corners. "The king speaks of nothing but sin and redemption these days," Philippe complained one evening as they walked the shadowed corridors. Yesterday, he ordered an investigation into reports of satanic rituals in the provinces. Jean-Baptiste kept his face carefully neutral, though inside he felt a familiar stirring of concern. Religious fervour had always been the greatest enemy of their kind, more dangerous than any witch-hunter's stake or peasant's torch. "His Majesty's spiritual journey is inconvenient," he admitted, "but perhaps we can turn it to our advantage." "How could increased religious scrutiny possibly benefit us? Think, young one. What better cover for creatures of darkness than to become champions of the light?" A thin smile crossed Jean-Baptiste's face. "Already I have suggested to the king that these provincial disturbances might be the work of Protestant agitators." Philippe's eyes widened with understanding, directing his religious zeal toward political enemies. Precisely. Humans are wonderfully skilled at seeing what they expect to see. Jean-Baptiste paused as a group of courtiers passed by, lowering his voice once they were alone again. "Besides, Madame de Maintenon is not as rigid in her piety as she appears." This was true enough. The king's secret wife harboured her own dark secrets, though they were mundane compared to vampirism. a past that included poverty, scandal, and acts of necessary ruthlessness on her climb to power. Jean-Baptiste had collected these secrets carefully over the years, not to blackmail her, but to understand her. Knowledge, after all, was the true currency of Versailles. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a breathless servant, one of the many mortals who served their kind in exchange for protection and privileges. "My lord," the man whispered, "there's been an incident in the Chapel Royal." Jean-Baptiste felt a chill that had nothing to do with his undead nature. The Chapel Royal was dangerous ground for his kind, filled with blessed objects and holy water. "Speak quickly." "One of the new ones, my lord, the young Vicomte de Cherigny. He tried to feed during evening mass." Philippe cursed softly, but Jean-Baptiste remained eerily still. "Casualties?" "2 choir boys, my lord. The bodies have been hidden, but—" The servant swallowed hard. "Father Lachaise saw something. He's with the king now." This was precisely the sort of disaster Jean-Baptiste had worked centuries to prevent. Lachaise was not only the king's confessor, but also one of the most influential Jesuits in France. If he had truly witnessed something supernatural— "Find the Vicomte," he ordered Philippe. "Bring him to the usual place, alive if possible, but do not take unnecessary risks." He turned to the servant. "Spread word through the usual channels. All feeding is suspended until further notice. Any vampire who disobeys will answer to me personally." As Philippe disappeared into the darkness, Jean-Baptiste made his way toward the king's private apartments. He would need all his centuries of experience to navigate this crisis. The political capital he had accumulated over decades might have to be spent in a single evening. He found the king's antechamber in chaos. Courtiers clustered in whispered groups, their faces pale with shock and fear. The Marquise de Montespan, though long out of favour, had emerged from her semi-retirement and was deep in conversation with Madame de Maintenon, a rare alliance that spoke to the gravity of the situation. Father Lachaise emerged from the king's chamber, his face ashen. Jean-Baptiste approached him with careful deference. "Your Reverence," he bowed. "I heard there was some disturbance during evening mass." The priest's eyes fixed on him with an unsettling intensity. "Comte de Morangias?" "Yes, a most disturbing incident. I saw—" He hesitated, as if struggling to make sense of his memories. "I saw something impossible." "The mind can play strange tricks in candlelight," Jean-Baptiste suggested smoothly, "especially when one is tired or troubled. Perhaps we should discuss what you think you saw somewhere more private." Lachaise seemed about to agree when the door to the king's chamber opened. Louis XIV emerged, his face troubled. "Father, a moment, please. Alone." The priest followed the king back into the chamber, leaving Jean-Baptiste to contemplate his next move. He caught Madame de Maintenon's eye and received a subtle nod. She, at least, seemed willing to help manage this crisis, though undoubtedly she would expect something in return. He was about to approach her when he felt a familiar presence. Philippe had returned, and from the urgent way he hovered at the edge of the crowd, the news wasn't good. "The Vicomte?" Jean-Baptiste asked quietly when they found a private corner. "Gone. But he left a message." Philippe's voice was tight with tension. "He claims he's going to reveal everything to the king, says the time for hiding is over." Jean-Baptiste closed his eyes briefly, fighting back a surge of ancient rage. Always there were young ones who thought they knew better, who believed their undead power made them invincible. They never learned from history, never understood that humans' greatest strength was their ability to unite against a common enemy. "Find our most trusted hunters," he ordered. "The Vicomte must not reach the king. Use whatever means necessary." "And if we're too late?" Then we implement the contingency plan. Jean-Baptiste's voice was cold. Every vampire in Versailles disappears before dawn. The network is dismantled, all evidence destroyed. But your position here, everything you've built, can be rebuilt elsewhere if necessary. Survival first, always. He straightened his coat. Now go. I must speak with Madame de Maintenon before... He was interrupted by screams from the king's chamber. The doors burst open, and Louis XIV himself staggered out, his face pale with shock. Behind him, Father Lachaise lay sprawled on the floor, blood pooling around his throat. The Vicomte de Chérigny stood in the centre of the chamber, his face transformed into its true vampiric aspect, blood dripping from his extended fangs. "Behold, your Majesty!" the young vampire shouted. "Behold the true face of your court!" Time seemed to slow as Jean-Baptiste assessed the situation. The Vicomte had sealed all their fates with this act of madness. Already he could see the horror and recognition dawning on some faces in the crowd. Courtiers who had harboured suspicions over the years, who were now seeing their darkest fears confirmed. There was only one way to salvage anything from this disaster. One final, desperate gambit that would destroy much of what he had built, but might preserve the greater secret of their kind. Moving faster than human eyes could follow, Jean-Baptiste crossed the chamber and drove a blessed silver dagger, one he had carried for centuries for just such an emergency, into the Vicomte's heart. As the young vampire crumbled to ash, Jean-Baptiste turned to face the king. "Forgive me, your Majesty," he said, allowing his own vampiric nature to show for the first time in decades. "I have served you faithfully in my fashion, hunting these creatures who would threaten your court. But now my failure to catch this one in time has exposed my presence." Louis stared at him in horror and fascination. What are you?" "A hunter of monsters, sire. One who must become like them to destroy them." The lie came easily, built on decades of careful groundwork. "There are more of his kind out there, hidden among the nobles of Europe. I am part of an ancient order dedicated to fighting them." It was a desperate plan, but one that played to Louis's love of secret societies and grand missions. Already Jean-Baptiste could see the king's horror beginning to transform into something else: calculation, interest, even excitement at the idea of being part of something hidden and important. "You have served me well," Louis said slowly. "Even in this deception." "Especially in this deception, your Majesty. The creatures I hunt must believe me to be one of them. Only thus can I protect your court." Jean-Baptiste bowed deeply. "Though now that my nature is exposed, I fear I must take my leave. There are others of his kind who must be hunted." "No." Louis's voice carried the absolute authority of the Sun King. "You will stay. We will speak privately of these matters. France must be protected from these creatures." And so, a new deception began, even greater than the last. Jean-Baptiste became Louis's secret weapon against the vampire threat, staging elaborate hunts that always seemed to drive the creatures away from France while leaving them free to operate in secret. The other vampires of Versailles went deeper underground but remained, their network now protected by the very authority that should have destroyed them. Years later, as Louis XIV lay dying, he called Jean-Baptiste to his bedside for one final conversation. "You never told me everything, did you?" the old king asked, his voice weak but his mind still sharp. Jean-Baptiste smiled sadly. "Would you have wanted me to, your Majesty?" Louis chuckled, then coughed. "No, I suppose not. Sometimes shadows serve the light in their own way." He gripped Jean-Baptiste's hand with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll continue to protect France." "Until the end of time, your Majesty." As the Sun King's light finally faded, Jean-Baptiste stood at the window, watching the sun rise over Versailles. Soon there would be a new king, new courtiers, new intrigues to manage. But for now, he allowed himself a moment to honour the passing of a worthy adversary and unlikely ally. In the end, Jean-Baptiste reflected, perhaps that was the true art of survival, not merely existing through the centuries, but finding ways to turn even disaster into opportunity. The game would continue, the dance would go on, and in the shadows behind the throne, the vampires of Versailles would endure. The sun climbed higher, and Jean-Baptiste withdrew to his hidden chambers. Tomorrow night would bring new challenges, new threats, new opportunities. But that was the nature of both court life and immortality, an eternal dance of power and deception, played out in the space between light and shadow, between truth and lies, between the world of humans and the realm of the undead. In the heart of Versailles, where the Sun King had built his monument to absolute power, the real authority had always belonged to those who understood that true power lay not in the light, but in the shadows that the light created. And there, in those shadows, Jean-Baptiste and his kind would continue their ancient game, eternal as the night itself. The shadows of Versailles still hold many secrets, dear listeners. If you wish to delve deeper into the darkness, to uncover more tales from the unholy chronicles, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Ring the death knell, that's the bell icon for the uninitiated, to be summoned whenever a new story emerges from these cursed pages. Share this tale with fellow seekers of the supernatural, for knowledge of the darkness is a burden best carried by many. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Perhaps you've sensed something similar in the halls of power in your own time. The creatures of the night are eternal after all. Until our paths cross again in the darkness, I am Elias Nocturne, and these are the unholy tales.